Those of you who follow my Twitter feed, the I have been showing the film A Man for All Seasons in class, in part because we're reading Moore's Utopia, and also to kind of give some back backdrop, some historical background information for England, right, and the Reformation and the Reformations and all that. And I was really struck this time around by watching the interactions of Henry in particular. If you know the film, Robert Shaw is to me just spectacular in terms of his capturing of the kind of the, the unstable but powerful and awesome personality of Henry. You can imagine that someone of Henry's talents would have been pretty astonishing to be around, even if you were an important person, like Moore was. But unfortunately, I think the image that we have of Henry VIII is that big fat portrait, and all of the wives and the dead wives and all that, and those are all fair because those are real. But the young Henry was extraordinary, powerful, athletic, handsome, and intelligent. And I think Robert Shaw really captures that part of Henry VIII. And it's important because even someone with a prodigious intellect like Moore is dealing with essentially a potential monster, in part because of the powers that become kind of galvanized into the person of Henry are such that the burning question of the time is, what is the proper formation and education for the prince? More the humanist, of course, had grand ideas about that, but it's almost as if he knew that if the prince who would become king is not properly formed, then the monstrosity of appetites would be unleashed. And sure enough, we see that in the person. So when when Henry comes to visit Moore and his family at Chelsea House, um, watching that interaction between these two men is really so subtle and so rich. And there's a real kind of play and dance that's going on. Henry wants Moore as a friend. Thomas, he wants Henry to be a friend, but Thomas knows that you can't really be friends with a god or a king because there's no way in which you can overcome the radical inequalities that their respective status affords. And so it got me thinking about status and the games of status that we play. There's political status and there's economic status, and there's all these different sort of forms of status. And I find when I talk about status, it can make people very defensive about their own relationship to status and the games that they play and interact with, the games that they engage with in order to establish hierarchies of status. A couple months back, this was being talked about because Aaron Renn published in his Substack, I think it was in October of 2024, and he was talking about the limitations of, if you don't go to New York, if you don't play in the big leagues, then your ceiling is always going to be limited. it sort of led to a larger meditation, or sort of questions about, should this even be something someone does? And I think part of the thing that was missing in the conversation, through no fault to Aaron. Aaron's a great guy. I've spoken with him a couple of times. How's that for a status drop? Um, but he really wasn't talking about this. But there was a lot of negative reactions. So, well, why are you seeking status anyway? And and a couple of people were like, well, as soon as I stopped caring about status, then everything was fine. And I think it betrays a sort of low res resolution naivete about the different types of status that we seek. For some people, they seek the status afforded by athletic prowess. Some people seek the kind of status afforded by um, winning in the game of finance, big money, big bank accounts, big cars, those kind of uh, somewhat typical markers of um, making it big. But you can also notice, in my experience, some of the most wicked games of status were engaged in relatively low stakes financials when I was in academia, when I was in graduate school. That was wild, nasty stuff, really playing with questions of status, even though outside of that particular arena, nobody cared if a paper got published or if you got to work with a particular professor or anything like that. But within certain arenas, that kind of competition can be fierce and even a little bloodthirsty. Um, on any faculty, you see that. But in any restaurant that I've worked in, there was always the sort of the status games that cooks would play with one another, and waiters and waitresses would play with one another, and bartenders. And because I remember in college I worked at a bar and grill, and I was a short timer. I was doing it for the summer. I was kind of a hired hand, just doing my thing. But some of those people did it, like this is what they did, and they were absolutely ruthless about getting the right shifts and getting the right bars and um, windows of time and who they would work with and which tables they got. It became a real nasty fight for status. And so there's all kinds of different ways to hijack status games. And some people would flirt with the manager, some people would essentially um, bribe the manager, hustle. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to do it. But um, as I look back on the whole notion of status games, I'm struck that they almost always take place unconsciously. You're engaged in these games in ways that you don't seem to always be in control of. And so, going back to the interaction between Thomas More and Henry VIII, Henry announces right away, he's like, I'll leave you out of this issue uh, with my marriage. And of course, nobody really believes that. But More can't tell him the truth because in games of status, there's a hierarchy, and one of the flexes of being on the upper echelons of a hierarchy is you can kind of ignore, in some sense, you can ignore those people that are lower down in the hierarchy, and yet Henry needs More's blessing. And even though he is the great king with all of that power, power enough to name himself the head of the church in England, powerful enough to take the monasteries, powerful enough to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, powerful enough to do all of these extraordinary and frightening things. And yet, the one thing he couldn't get was the blessing of his teacher and then friend and then Chancellor Thomas More. It got me to thinking, there's that old adage that zero is a special number. And for Henry, even though he's essentially a kind of unchecked God in his orbit, in his little mini-verse. Mini-verse, it becomes England, but you follow my, I think you follow what I'm saying here. He had to have everybody. There could be zero dissent for his desires, with Anne Boleyn in this case, and More, and just a few others, Bishop Fisher to name, just a few, he could not abide that not everyone was willing to blow sunshine up as what. And so you've got that ratchet. He's going to have to flex that status. And, for More, I mean, this is an important and big, powerful guy. He's the Chancellor of the Realm. He's Henry's right-hand man, super powerful. And yet even he kind of can't quite push back. And so instead of all the other courtiers who are playing the games of status, which would give you position at court, More is playing a kind of different status game. I mean, he's clearly doing well in the worldly status game, but the one status game that he cares about the most is holiness and faithfulness. And so he invokes his conscience. And I think tomorrow I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of conscience and like what is it and where it comes from. And it's kind of a weird thing when you really start to kind of poke at it a little bit. Like, where does it come from? But anyway, More is, it's like I can't. I want to swear the oath. I would love to swear the oath. I would prefer to swear the oath. But that status game that you're asking me to play is not, in the end, the status game that I really know I need to play. And that status game, of course, is holiness or blessedness. So, um, kids, if you're watching at home, I think it's important to recognize and to become conscious of which game am I playing? Which status game am I playing? That's enough for today. Please hit the like and subscribe button. Leave a comment. I love talking with you guys. Y'all take care. Bye bye.